today's shocking story of betrayal. I never thought I would be the kind of woman who found herself in a situation like this. If you had asked me a few years ago, I would have said I had everything I could ever want: a loving husband, a comfortable home, and a steady, predictable life. But sometimes life has a way of unraveling slowly, almost imperceptibly, until you look up one day and realize you've wandered into territory you never expected. My name is Rachel, and for the last 7 years I've been married to Mark. We met in college, and back then everything about him felt safe and familiar. He was the kind of man who planned his life meticulously, who made decisions with logic instead of impulse, was steady, reliable, and exactly what he thought I needed. I suppose in many ways I still think he is, but over time that steadiness became something else, something that felt less like comfort and more like stagnation. At first, it was just the little things: the way he came home from work exhausted, barely looking up from his phone during dinner, the way our conversations revolved around bill schedules and responsibilities, rather than dreams or even just idle laughter. I convinced myself that this was normal, that all marriages settle into a rhythm where passion gives way to partnership. Then I met Daniel, and suddenly he wasn't so sure Daniel was Mark's boss. He owned the small but growing consulting firm where Mark worked, and from the moment I met him at a company dinner, how unsettled me. It wasn't just that he was handsome, though he was in an effortless, commanding way that made people listen when he spoke. It was more the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to see people in a way that made them feel important. I remember that first night clearly. The restaurant was dimly lit, the air humming with polite conversation and the clinking of glasses. I dressed carefully, wanting to look presentable without trying too hard. When Daniel greeted me, his handshake was firm, his smile warm. "So you're the woman behind the man?" he said, his voice laced with easy charm. I laughed politely, feeling strangely flustered. I suppose you could see that. As the evening wore on, I found myself watching him, not in an obvious way, but in the way you sometimes watch someone who fascinates you. He was confident but not arrogant. He asked thoughtful questions, and when he spoke to you, it felt like you were the only person in the room. It wasn't until later that I realized how rare that was, how rare it felt, at least in my own marriage. Mark had always been a good man, a hardworking man, but over the years had stopped seeing me in the way Daniel seemed to. In just one evening, I wasn't blaming him. I knew that life had a way of making people stop looking at each other the way they once did, but for the first time in a long time, I found myself wondering if I had faded into the background of my own life after that night. I didn't think much about Daniel, or at least I told myself I didn't, but he started showing up in small ways. A quick conversation at one of Mark's work functions, a polite email when I helped organize a charity event through the company. Each interaction was brief, professional, and yet I found myself looking forward to them more than I should have. I didn't recognize it as anything more than harmless admiration till the night of the holiday party. The office had rented out a beautiful event space downtown, complete with sparkling lights and live music. Mark had been preoccupied most of the evening, caught up in work talk with his colleagues, and I had wandered toward the balcony for some fresh air. That's where Daniel found me, escaping the madness. He asked, stepping beside me. I smiled something like that. He leaned against the railing, looking out over the city. "You don't seem like the kind of woman who likes being in the background." His words caught me off guard. "What Mac saw you say that?" He glanced at me, then his expression thawed, because when you talk, you have this way of making people lean in like they don't want to miss a word. That's not the kind of presence that belongs in the background. I didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever said something like that to me before, not even Mark. We stood there for a while, the silence between us strangely comfortable. Then just before he turned to leave, he said something I couldn't forget. "It's a shame, he murmured. He frowned. "What is?" He hesitated, then smiled, though there was something almost sad about it, that he doesn't see you the way he should. And then he was gone, leaving with nothing but the weight of his words and the unsettling realization that deep down I had been thinking the same thing. I didn't do anything about it. Not then, but after that night, something changed. I started noticing the ways Mark and I had drifted apart, the way we sat in opposite ends of the couch at night, lost in our own screens, the way our conversations were filled with logistics instead of laughter. I tried to tell myself it was normal, that this was just what marriage looked like after nearly a decade, but then I would remember the way Daniel had looked at me, the way his words had made something inside me stir, and I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I was meant for something more than fading into the background. It wasn't an affair, not yet, but it was something. I knew deep down that something had already begun. In the days and weeks after the holiday party, I found myself thinking about Daniel more often than I cared to admit. It wasn't intentional, at least that's what I told myself, but his words lingered in my mind like an echo playing when I least expected them. That he doesn't see you the way Hess told. I wasn't naive, I knew what those words implied, and I knew the kind of path it could lead me down if I wasn't careful, so I tried to shake it off to focus on my life with Mark to remind myself of the vows we had made all those years ago. But the problem with waking up to something you've been ignoring for too long is that you can't just unsee ideas. Started noticing things, smell insignificant things that suddenly didn't feel so insignificant anymore. The way Mark barely looked up from his phone when I walked into the room, the way our conversations felt more like up-to-testing coworkers than the easy late-night talks we used to have. And then there were the moments with Daniel. They were never anything inappropriate. A quick hello when I stopped by the facility, dropped something off from Mark, a politic exchange at another company gathering, and yet every time our eyes met, I felt something shift, something unspoken pass between us. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was nothing more than a silly crush, the kind you get when your life feels stagnant and someone comes along who makes you feel seen again. But deep down I knew better. The moment that changed, everything happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. I'd been running errands when I got a call from Mark. I had forgotten an important set of documents for a presentation and needed me to bring them to his office. It wasn't a big deal. I had done things like this before, but when I arrived, I was told he was stuck in a meeting and wouldn't be available for a while. I considered leaving the documents with his assistant, but then Daniel appeared. He greeted, his expression warm and seeing you here. I held up the folder. Mark forgot these. I was just going to leave them with his assistant. Daniel glanced toward that closed conference room door where Mark was presumably tied up in business discussions. Then he looked back at me, hesitating for only a second before offering a small smile. You have a few minutes. I was just about to grab a coffee. I should have said no, I knew that, but instead I found myself nodding, following him down the hall and into his office. It was larger than I expected, sleek and modern, with a wall of windows overlooking the city. He gestured toward the small coffee station in the corner. Cream, sugar? He asked. Already pouring 2 cups. Just cream, I said, watching as handed me a mug. For a moment we sipped in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with something I couldn't quit him. You look tired, he said, finale studying me. Everything okay? I let out a soft laugh. You were the CEO of a growing company. I think you have bigger things to worry about than whether or not I looked tired. He didn't laugh. If anything, he seemed more serious. That doesn't mean I don't notice him. Anything about the way he said it made me stomach twist. I swallowed, glancing down at my coffee. I guess I just feel a little lost. My message was more honesty than I had intended to give, but once the words were out, I couldn't take them back. Daniel didn't press, but he didn't look away either. That makes 2 of us. I frowned, slightly surprised by his response. You, he let out a breath, leaning against the edge of his desk. Every assumes that because I built this company, I must have everything figured out, but the truth is success doesn't mean you don't have moments where you wonder if you're where you're supposed to. I nodded, understanding more than Ewan did. Tone it. I know the feeling. I murmured. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The air between us felt heavy, charged. Then her smile, breaking the tension. Justina, maybe we should start a club for people who feel a little lost. I laughed softly, shaking my head. I think that club would have more members than you'd expect. Another silence. Another shared look that lasted just a little too long. I should have left. Then I should have handed over documents and walked out of that office without looking back, but instead he lingered, finishing my coffee, feeling the weight of his gaze even as I avoid needing it directly. Finally, he cleared his throat. Mark should be out of his meeting. Zoom, want me to let his assistant know we are here? I nodded, standing a little too quickly. Yeah, thanks. As I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. Rachel hesitated, glancing over my shoulder, hesitated me for a moment, his expression unreal. Then he simply said, take care of yourself. It was such a simplistic statement, and yet it felt like something more. I nodded, forcing a small smile. You too. And then I walked away, my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with unsettling realization that I was already in too deep. I told myself it was harmless, that a conversation over caffeine meant nothing, but deep down I knew better. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop for weeks after that afternoon in Daniel's office. I told myself that nothing had really happened, that it was just a conversation, a cup of coffee, a shared moment of vulnerability. People had those all the time, right? It didn't mean anything except that it did. Becca's. After that I started noticing the way I looked forward to running into him, the way my stomach fluttered at the thought of seeing him again, the way I played our conversations in my head, picking apart every word, every glance, every hesitation. I told myself that I was just looking for something that was missing in my marriage, that this was just a phase, a temporary distraction from the monotony of life with Mark. But deep down, I knew I was standing at the edge of something dangerous, and then the moment came when I had to make a choice. It was a Thursday evening when Daniel called me. It was unexpected, had never reached out to me directly there, but as soon as I saw his name on the phone screen, I felt my heart skip. Hello. I answered, trying to sound casual. Rachel. He said, his voice warm. I hope I'm not bothering you. I swallowed. No, not at all. There was a brief pause before he spoke again. I'm in town for a late meeting, and he was about to grab dinner before heading home. I know it's last minute, but if you're free, I'd love the company. I hesitated. I knew what this was. I knew what it could become if I let it, but at that moment, I wasn't thinking about consexes. I wasn't thinking about Mark or our marriage or the life we had built together. I was thinking about the way Daniel made me feel seen, and so I said yes. The restaurant was small and intimate, tucked away on a quiet street where we wouldn't run into anyone when you. The moment I walked in and saw him sitting at the corner table, I knew this was different from all our previous encounters. This wasn't an office event or a chance meeting. This was a choice. Hested when he saw me smiling in the teasy way. Office, I'm glad you came. I nodded, sliding into the seat across from him. Me too. The conversation was effortless as it always was with him. We talked about everything and nothing, the places we wanted to visit, the books we loved, the moments in life that had shaped us, and then somewhere between the first course and the second, he said something that made me breath catch. Rachel, I think you underestimated layers. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? He leaned forward, his eyes holding mine. I think you have spent so much time making sure everyone else is okay that you've forgotten to ask yourself what you really want. Words hit harder than I expected. He was right. For so long, I had been Mark's wife, the woman who kept things running smoothly, the one who made sure everything was in its right place, but somewhere along the way I had lost part of myself that had dreams and desires of hero. I don't know what I want, I admitted softly. Daniel studied me for a long moment before saying, maybe it's time you figured it out. And just like that, the choice became real, because this wasn't about Daniel. Not really. It was about me, a booth realization that I had been living a life that felt safe but not necessarily filling. And in that moment, I knew I had to make a decision, not about him, but about myself. I could have let things go further that night. I could have leaned into the feelings that had been simmering between us for months, but instead I did something I never expected. I walked away, not because I didn't want them, but because I needed to figure out, whoa, I was without him, without Mark, without anyone else defining my life form. When I got home that night, Mark was asleep, unaware of the battle I had just fought within myself, and as I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching him breathe, I realized something. I'd have been blaming him for not seeing me, but maybe truth was I had stopped seeing myself first. The next morning, I asked him, Mark, if we could talk not about Danielle, not about the things that had almost happened, but about us, about the space that had grown between us, the things we had stopped saying, the ways we had let our marriage become something passive instead of something intentional. I didn't know if we could fix it. I didn't know if I even wanted to, but I knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to spend the rest of my life fading into the background. No matter what happened next, I was going to choose myself, and maybe, just maybe, that was the real beginning of my story.